Developers, welcome back for our continued ramp up into JavaScript with our foundations class. We're going to go into the 02 variables file to discuss more variables, discuss more things about variables because it's a quick topic, but there's a lot of details in here that you should be familiar with as we start to build software. So we've already looked at strings. So here we have a string declared var, again, var, keyword, message being the name of the variable, and we're assigning it a value that here you can put double quotes around strings. So what we're going to cover here is all the different ways to make a string. You can use double quotes. You can use single quotes. Ooh, what I'm missing here, semicolon. Again, get into a good habit of using semicolons. There are going to be some extensions that we use in the near future that will have automatically put some semicolons in for you. And then you can use this thing called a backtick, which is this character that you're going to get used to typing. It's the character that's located right below the tilde, right? So to the left of the number one on most keyboards, the backtick. So you have these three strings that I've declared now. Now, if I go and hit save here, let's go open up this file with live server, and here comes my default browser firing up. Let me move that over to the right. Let me move my VS Code here to the left, and I'm going to hide my Explorer. So when this loads up, by the way, look, when this loads up, there's going to be this little check mark in green. There's a white check mark with the green background there, so that you know everything's loaded up. And you can see that the declarations of the strings, right? You can't really tell the difference by how they were assigned a value here on the left-hand side, right? So they're just strings. So the backtick now, right? The backtick is going to come in handy later when we use it to in a thing called string interpolation. So that's later on when we get to strings. Now, really cool thing about declaring variables is that you can also declare variables more than one on a given line. You'll notice here that instead of me saying semicolon, new line var count, semicolon, new line var size, etc., I could totally do that. I can declare two variables, right? One on each line. And then I'm going to come in here now, and instead of putting semicolons, what you do is that you put in a comma, right? A comma, and then you don't have to use the keyword again to say that, hey, I'm declaring a variable. So the keyword name equals value, comma, name equals value. That's another way you can do it. So important to know that you'll see this oftentimes in libraries that you might be importing and using. Again, if you get these little errors that you don't understand what they're at, you mouse over them so that you can see the error a little bit more, some more details about that error. You could go to the terminal, new terminal, and under the problems tab, you're going to see the problems highlighted there. Again, potentially a little bit more convenient for you to see the errors there. So we can declare variables. By the way, we haven't talked about this yet, but this variable now, the variables that I have here on this line, age, count, and size, these are numbers, right? So the variables with strings, they get a quote, a double quote, or a backtick. And then the strings, they get, again, the double quote or the single quote. So I've just hit save on here, so I'm expecting the page to load up and we'll see football showing up. Now, you can't mix and match. You can't say, hey, I'm going to start this off with a double quote and I'm going to end it with a single quote. That doesn't make sense. If you started out with a single quote, end it with a single quote. If you started out with a double quote, end it with a double quote, right? So single quote or double quote, we'll see that football renders here as a variable as well. And so that's great. Now, while I'm here, let's talk about naming convention of variables. So if you notice that age, count, and size, the fact that I've given them meaningful names gives you some type of indication of what I could potentially be using these variables for, right? This might be the age of a person. I'm counting something here. And then there's a size, right? So maybe I'm measuring the size of, the foot, the soccer cleats, the football cleats that someone might be wearing. I've got 10 people on my team, and then the average age is 20, right? I could be saying things like that. So they're short names, but they're meaningful, right? They could have a good amount of meaning. This is preferable over something like, even if I just did this, and then actually I just call this T. I'm going to say T. And so now these short name, very terse variables, you really want to avoid, all right? It's going to be really easy for you to just throw up and just type something out that might be really short because you're trying to abbreviate, maybe save some space or something. But don't do that. Don't worry about that too much right now. Do focus on trying to have meaningfully named variables. So I'm going to Control Z to undo and back that out. Have meaningful names. Now, it's really hard, right? Sometimes it's just going to be, you're going to find yourself just like thinking about it for much longer than you would want to think about what should you name this variable. Yes, it is difficult because, and later on when you begin to appreciate how important it is that these names on these variables are important, you're going to think about it twice, 3 or 4 times, because you know that later on when the next developer a week from now picks up this code, you want them to understand what it was that you were trying to say, what it is that you were trying to write some code around. And more often than not, that developer is going to be you, right? So you're trying to be nice to yourself in the future. Next thing to talk about variables is here I have this variable commented out, and you'll notice that I'm getting all sorts of different errors, right? I'm getting all sorts of different errors because this is not proper naming convention. One interesting rule about naming variables is that they can't start with numbers. You can have a number in them, right? So here's name 1. You can have a number within the variable name. You just can't have it, right? This is an empty string. Number at end. You can have the number at the end of the string. You can have the number in the middle of the string. It's okay. You can see that if I put numbers inside of that name, it totally is fine. There's no errors that show up in VS Code, and there's going to be no errors over here because it allows everything to come through. All right, so keep that in mind. That doesn't come into play too often because once you learn that, you just know I'm not going to put a number at the beginning of a variable. But in the beginning, you might be inclined to do so. The next thing to talk about, again, some core rules around variables, is naming convention. So here, this thing is actually called a backtick. This guy's called a backtick. It's not a single quote, it's a double quote. So if I was going to give this guy a better name, backtick might be a really good name. But JavaScript naming convention says that it should be Camelcase. And so Camelcase says that the variable, right? Now, I'm assuming now that backtick, I'm going to assume that backtick is actually maybe a 2-word name. I haven't looked it up in the dictionary. Let's assume that backtick is a 2-word name. So what Camelcase naming convention says is that essentially the first letter of the variable, in this case B, is lowercase. And then we're going to capitalize at basically what would normally be a new word, right? So if I said here that I wanted my variable to be my message, this is not proper naming convention. I should call it my message, right? Let me give you another example. Var first name is equal to Gregorio. This, and this works, right? This renders correctly. There's no error that's shown. There's no error that's shown, and like the computer can completely tell what's going on. Here's a variable first name. It points to this value. Everything is fine. But naming convention is really important when we get into different scenarios. And so here, the naming convention should be a capital N, first name, right? Same thing now if I wanted to put a last name, and I said var last name is equal to Rojas. So this is now okay. This follows naming convention. This naming convention. There's actually a name for this naming convention as well. This naming convention is called Pascal, which is basically every word starts with a capital. Depending on your middle tier language that you pick, Camelcase is going to be a thing for you. If you stay in JavaScript, then it's 90% of the time Camelcase, where we start with a lowercase and every word thereafter is capitalized, right? It starts with a capital. Last name. So keep that in mind. Naming convention is one of those things that's really important for new developers, because for us senior developers, we can tell someone who's disciplined, who's a disciplined software developer. We look for disciplined software developers. We look for experienced software developers. And we know that naming convention is something that is valued by the industry, because we know how important later on what good naming convention and the ability to stick to it and show it in your code samples, how we know how important that is. So we look for that. If you start writing JavaScript like this and you present it to me, I start to think, as someone who's been in the industry a long time, they're not necessarily following naming conventions. What else are they not doing, right? So and that might sound a little bit strict, and that's perfectly fine, because you're here to learn from me and learn what people like me think. And believe it or not, people like me think in this way, that if you're not putting a capital N there, if you're putting a capital F here, you start looking a little like, I don't know what's going on with this person. I'm going to have to take a deeper look. Might have to poke at them a little bit more for their skills. So Camelcase naming convention starts with a lowercase. Subsequent words that would have been normal words are capitalized. Okay. Always declare a variable. The single quotes, the backticks. You're going to have your choice of that. Backticks are going to be required when you start doing some other operations called string interpolation. Always end your variables and your statements here, by having a semicolon, which, by the way, here is one complete statement. It spans 2 lines, but there's actually one complete statement, right? And the semicolon here is what signals the end of the statement. The new line here, in fact, you might see this as a standard on Teams. But notice how I hit save there, and it auto-formatted and lined up everything here nice and neat at this specific space. That's just a tool. I actually have a tool. You'll probably have the same type of behavior, because you're going to have the same tools with the workspace. It knows that if I was going to tab these in, it's part of a statement to put this. Once I put the semicolon there, okay, if this statement is going to reach across multiple lines, then the new lines, we're going to tab them in. And it even does something as much as if I can't even put a space there, because again, the rules for convention, because we're trying to establish a pattern of even how we write simple statements like this, we want to try and enforce a pattern there. So that is going to prepare. This is going to continue to prepare you now for when we start writing more and more JavaScript.